hike with a beautiful destination, and partly because Sky Pond, far enough away from most folks, was reputed to have good fishing. Well, the trail was challenging. And I remember telling another hiker on the way up that I was glad I had spent a lot of time on a stair climber at the gym. And then I got to the scramble. I looked at the rock wall that stood between me and Sky Pond. I sat down and ate an energy bar, contemplating the climb and the potential for fish. I decided that I could fish elsewhere, that is, back down the hill at the lock, and not put myself at risk by climbing that rock face. As I started back down the mountain, I remembered another challenging climb. Every year, my son's scout troop set out to summit a 14er. The Boy Scouts in Colorado have developed a special patch for those who've done it. That year, it was Mount Sherman, according to some, Colorado's easiest 14er. We left base camp pre-dawn and started the climb. Lots of folks, including some scouts, pooped out at various points along the way. I was determined. I made it to the final saddle. A very narrow and windy ridge stood between me and the summit. I pondered and decided whether I had made it to 14,000 feet or not, my family would rather I got home safely than have me blown off the side of that ridge. Perhaps I'm a little too cautious for mountain climbing, although I suppose there's still time to bag a 14er. I could ride the cog train to the top of Pikes Peak. 2 disappointments, results of my own hesitancies to be sure, but both raised an underlying question: why do we climb the mountains? Exercise? The challenge and sense of accomplishment? Because it's there. A desire for the view? Hungry fish? Or do we hope the experience will change us? The reasons, I'm sure, are many and varied. Mountains. There are a lot of them to our west. And on this day, our lessons are about mountains as well. And so I had to return to those old questions, but with greater specificity. Why did those folks climb mountains? What were they expecting? 6 of the most famous mountain climbers in history, Moses, Elijah, Jesus, Peter, James, and John. And given my own experience, I had to wonder whether any of them were nervous approaching the summit. Moses, major climber, he goes up and down Mount Sinai numerous times. The first, of course, is when he's tending his father-in-law's flocks after fleeing his privileged life in Egypt. He's at the mountain. It's at the mountain that he sees the burning bush and desires to know more. If he was fearful, his curiosity overruled his hesitancy, but then the voice comes from the bush, and Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. From that bush on the mountain, God gave Moses his first mission: lead the Israelites out of bondage and bring them back to the mountain where they will worship God. From that bush, on that mountain, God reveals the holy name: I am that I am. Moses hesitates, protests, fearful of the responsibility. Please, just send somebody else. But the God who is prevails. On the mountain, the mission begins. Moses returns to Egypt and eventually gains the Israelites' release. After escaping the pursuing Egyptian army, they arrive at the base of Mount Sinai, where we're told the people shook with fear. Yet Moses goes up again, returning with the 10 commandments. He goes up again for more instruction and laws. Upon his return from that 40-day sojourn, he finds that the people, fearful that he might not return, had set up a golden calf to worship. Furious, Moses breaks the original tablets and cleanses the camp. He returns to the mountain again to intercede on behalf of the people. That may have caused some trepidation. While there, he asks to see God's glory. God shields Moses' eyes, but passes by so that Moses sees only his back. Moses secures a second set of tablets of the covenant and returns to the people with his face aglow, causing fear among those who saw him. That's our reading this morning. By the way, the horns with which Moses is often depicted comes from a mistranslation regarding his shining face. Moses climbed the mountain out of curiosity that was greater than his fear, and there he encountered the God who is. He ascended the mountain several more times, I would imagine with varying levels of fear, to receive instruction, to intercede, and is given a mission. He was the one specifically chosen by God to free God's people and give them God's law. The man who went up the mountain came down a different man. Elijah was also a climber, although not as frequently as Moses, but twice on 2 different mountains he encountered God. First, after a period of faithfulness to God, the people of Israel strayed into idolatry, following the lead of King Ahab's wife Jezebel. To settle the question of whose God is mightier, Elijah met the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, one against hundreds. Perhaps a bit fear-inducing. The battle of sacrifices ensued, and Baal's prophets were embarrassed. Elijah's sacrifice was accepted, and Baal's folks were put to the sword. That outcome infuriated Jezebel and Ahab. They threatened Elijah, and he fled for another mountain, Mount Sinai, seeking refuge out of fear. It was then that God appeared to Elijah, not face to face, not in a hurricane, earthquake, or fire, but in a still, small, murmuring sound. God commissions Elijah to return, anoint Elisha as successor, and jointly with him to restore Israel to the worship of God. As with Moses, Elijah ascended the mountain, fearful, no doubt, encountered the God who is, and was given a mission to ensure good leadership of God's people. The man who went up the mountain came down a different man. And today we're at the Mount of Transfiguration, usually identified with Mount Tabor. Luke tells us why Jesus went up the mountain: to pray, ostensibly. Jesus often sought renewal on high places. But did Jesus know what to expect this time? He told the disciples what being a Messiah really meant: he would die. Was his ascent of the mountain going to confirm that? Jesus invites Peter, James, and John to accompany him. What might they have feared, having just been given the news that their leader was soon to die? There they see Jesus' mountain-climbing predecessors, Moses and Elijah. And something, no doubt fear-inducing, happens. Jesus is transfigured, a metamorphosis. The disciples see and hear the three discussing Jesus' exodus. They hear the voice from the cloud, eerily similar to the voice Jesus heard at his baptism, with the instruction to them to listen to him. As the cloud lifts, Moses and Elijah are no longer to be seen. It's Jesus who is now the sole leader of God's people and the one who gives God's law. Jesus embodies all who God is and how God would have us live. The conclusion of Jesus' mission is before him. The extension of that mission is given to Peter, James, and John. The four who went up the mountain descended, all transformed in one way or another. The various ascents up mountains, including the mountain of transfiguration, serve, it seems to me, as fulcrums. In all of the stories, our mountain climbers ascend, their relationships with God compelling them to climb despite fears behind or ahead. They encounter the God who is. They descend, changed by the experience, and are given new missions. We, as individuals and as a congregation, may be their heirs from time to time. We may receive summons, perhaps not always welcome, to ascend various literal or figurative mountains. Some may hold threat. Some may hold promise. I imagine we're often as fearful as Moses, Elijah, Jesus, Peter, James, and John at the prospects. What might happen? Do we have the strength? Are we brave enough? What might we be asked? Can we see God in the request? Are we willing to be transformed? Success at Sky Pond or Mount Sherman probably wouldn't have transformed me on the spot. But my memories of those experiences return often and work on me. Perhaps a little bit like the leaven we heard about last week, changing my attitudes, challenging my fears about the various mountains that will inevitably arise before me. Perhaps, again, returning to last week's reading, the kingdom of heaven is like a mountain which a person went to climb and discovered the God who is. Amen.